So my name is Lis Hammond, and I trained and worked as a counseling psychologist in the UK and working mostly in rehabilitation context. I later became a senior lecturer and a researcher at Teesside University, where I did some of this research we're going to talk about. I returned to my home country in Denmark in 2019, and I'm now working here as an independent researcher. During my training, I worked in a brain injury rehabilitation setting, and I was asked to facilitate some adjustment groups, which I did, and that was interesting. But I asked my supervisor, what is adjustment? And I got a fairly vague reply, as in it's coming to terms with what's happened, it's accepting changes and so on. But and then I said, but how does it work? I kind of need to know how things work in order to do them properly. How can it be understood? And I did not find a satisfactory answer at the time. So I basically started researching it to find the answer. Once I had this model that we are going to talk about, I was quite happy I had understood what it was and didn't think further of it. But later on, colleagues said this is something you need to keep working on. So here we are, several years later. In terms of what psychosocial adjustment, what I see psychosocial adjustment being now after my research, obviously when life changes due to illness or critical events that lead to functional limitations, that typically means that life can no longer be lived in the way that it was before. So psychosocial adjustment is the process of change following such life-changing illness and or events. And this process has the aim of making life work again in a new way within the constraints of the acquired functional limitations. In terms of biopsychosocial, of course, it is biopsychosocial. However, so rehabilitation, since it was established, has largely consisted of biomedical, biomechanical, and cognitive approaches that have been highly developed and established, and they're highly systematic and specialized. This is less so for the psychosocial aspects of rehabilitation. There are many tools, there are many practices, but there is mounting evidence that support of psychosocial adjustment, or what I prefer to call psychosocial rehabilitation, is wholly inadequate in most areas. So we need a particular focus on psychosocial adjustment and rehabilitation, which is why we sort of leave out the bio. We want to have this added focus on the psychosocial aspects of rehabilitation. In good psychosocial adjustment, we see relevant changes in behaviors and attitudes, not just to health and self-management, but also to daily living in general. So this includes relevant adjustments to work life, social roles, personal identity, and it happens to allow for sort of optimal function within the constraints of these functional challenges that people have to live with. Contrary to that, in poor adjustment, we see inadequate self-management, we see wider challenges of function socially and emotionally, and over time, the development of anxiety, depression, negative identity changes, and these things lead to further functional decline. For many long-term conditions, it also can lead to deterioration of health. It can lead potentially, depending on the condition, to long-term complications. Poor adjustment typically leads to a poor quality of life for the individual. Socioeconomically, it has high costs in terms of higher use of health and social service resources. For instance, figures from NHS England, they're a few years old now, but they showed that around 25% of the population live with long-term conditions, but they account for 70% of the NHS expenditure. Other such studies suggest that only 50% of people with long-term conditions adjust adequately to living with their condition. So this, at least to me, suggests that cost could be reduced if we were only better at supporting people's psychosocial adjustment process. So this is why we need psychosocial rehabilitation, and which is the process of professionals helping individuals turn the adjustment process around from a negative direction to a more constructive and positive direction. Psychosocial rehabilitation in long-term somatic conditions is currently termed rehabilitation psychology. So this term originates from USA, and it is emerging in some European countries. And the big question is whether there is a difference at all. So in Denmark, a recent white paper on rehabilitation proposes the use of the recovery method broadly in all types of rehabilitation, both somatic and psychiatric. So here there's an attempt to merge the psychiatric tradition with the emerging somatic tradition. I am chair and co-founder of the International Network of Research into Psychosocial Adjustment and Rehabilitation, also called the INRIPA. We argue that psychosocial adjustment is relevant for all life changes involving long-term functional challenges. So not just long-term physical conditions and mental health conditions, but also displacement, victims of crime, war, and torture. And by taking an overall approach, rather than working on adjustment to specific conditions, we believe and we hope to speed up the development of psychosocial rehabilitation practices. In fact, I am working with Danish researchers and organizations on finding funding for a project on psychosocial adjustment of refugees and immigrants suffering from complex PTSD and/or complex somatic multimorbidity. Arguably, very few have as complex psychosocial adjustment challenges than this population. So my answer to your question is that the difference is that they are two separate traditions based on the historical separation of soma and psyche, a dichotomy that we now know is outdated. In my mind, as is also the position we hold in INRIPA, psychosocial adjustment and rehabilitation is the same whether you have a somatic or a psychiatric condition. We need to merge the two traditions and pool our resources. IMACC, it stands for the Integrative Model of Adjustment to Chronic Conditions. I always refer to it as IMACC. We believe that IMACC is the first clinically applicable model proposing how the underlying dynamic process of change over time works. So the biopsychosocial model, it stipulates a range of factors that interact, but not how they interact. IMACC provides the how. So this Danish white paper on rehabilitation, it talks about person-centered working with an inside-out perspective. IMACC shows the adjustment process from an intrapersonal or inside-out perspective. The strength of IMACC is that it allows for a detailed and systematic assessment of individual adjustment needs and barriers, as well as providing a tool for treatment planning and psychosocial rehabilitation. Is it a synthesis or Is it innovative? I think it's both. The model was developed through a grounded theory approach based on data from people having experienced the adjustment process. Most other adjustment models are developed through theoretical synthesis. So IMACC is innovative in that respect. But a process model based on actual experiences is holistic and therefore inherently a synthesis of all the aspects relevant to psychosocial adjustment, including what we already know. Well, the research question was whether IMACC would be compatible with the ICF model. IMACC is a process model where the ICF is a classification and a factor model. The ICF does not, at this point in time, concern itself with the process of how the factors interact dynamically or how people move from one state of adjustment to another. The assumption was therefore that to be compatible, IMACC needed to be able to accommodate all the main ICF components. IMACC itself consists of 13 components, and from the original study on type 2 diabetes, we created new data sets, each consisting of the data underlying each of the IMACC components. That data was then recoded using the ICF classification codes. And the results showed that all the 5 main ICF components were present in each IMACC component. More importantly, the patterns formed by the ICF codes were consistent with the definitions of each IMACC component and therefore demonstrating this compatibility. As mentioned, a systematic understanding of the dynamic change process is missing from the ICF. The addition to the ICF of a tool like IMACC has the potential to improve the psychosocial aspects of rehabilitation by providing a highly systematic approach for further research and clinical application. In my view, psychosocial rehabilitation is essential if we want to avoid health services crashing in an attempt to meet everyone's complex needs. Psychosocial rehabilitation concerns itself with helping individuals learn how to live as well as possible through self-management, self-care, and optimized function, not only physically and cognitively, but also socially and psychologically. So this requires all types of rehabilitation professionals to share the same broad rehabilitation competencies alongside their specialized skills, and that is a lot to ask. To support this, it's essential that they are provided with accessible and highly systematic approaches. And my personal vision is that IMACC is used as a central model by all rehabilitation professionals. So one challenge for multidisciplinary teams is that different professionals work from different models. If all used the same model of the person in the adjustment process, we would truly achieve an interdisciplinary working based on a detailed assessment of each individual's needs and barriers to adjustment. It is my hope that IMACC may one day be such a tool that will allow training of rehabilitation professionals on how to work in a person-centered and inside-out way. That's a good question. To me, multidisciplinary work is, as I said, working from the basis of different models, which are specific to the professions. Interdisciplinary is working from the same models, so having the same approach on top of the specialized approaches. That's my understanding of that difference.